Welcome, welcome, malchiks and devotchkas, to our little poddy woddy. I'm very glad to visit my two droogs, Matt and Elliot, here this first night for our second episode. I'm very grateful for all you out there slooshying our slovos. It should be a real horror show night, with plenty of smecking and 20 to 1, and hopefully a few things to engage your gullivers too. So sit back with a nice moloko as we dive into a Clockwork Orange.
Wow. That was, I think that's the most effort we've ever gone into. Well, I mean...
I'm scared. I'm about to go to the toilet.
I'll follow.
It's kind of weird how your brain automatically goes in... You know, after reading like 50 pages, you're already kind of thinking in the language of the book.
Yeah, it does start to come a lot more naturally. At the beginning, trying to decipher exactly what each word meant, I know you said that horror show, and to me as well, that we thought that meant bad for a lot of the beginning of the book, and then steadily you contextualise it and it starts to make more sense. But you do start to read it in the voice of Jimmy Savile, I find.
A true malchik.
Don't you read every book with that voice?
Before we go on to any more of our review, we'll go straight into Matthew. Matthew.
That sounds sinister. Obviously, this has affected you, this book. Okay, straight into the whiskey. So everyone, have a little taste.
Oh yeah. Okay.
We've got some very nice, very sophisticated ice designs in this whiskey today, so very excited about that.
Okay, so today we are drinking Smokehead Extra Rare. This is quite a heavy whiskey.
What's the price range of this bad boy?
This I bought duty free a litre for £32. Would have originally been 40. So you're looking with VAT in the UK, not VAT, with taxes in the UK.
But this was a litre bottle, so probably
Around 50.
Yeah, so probably no. But if it was 75 centilitres, it'd be a bit less.
Yeah, probably around the 30 to 35 mark.
So again, would you say mid range? Yeah.
Yeah, we'd call it mid-range.
More pricey than our whiskey last time.
No, because it would be the same because we bought a 75 centilitre last time. Well, this is a litre.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you did get it duty free, so...
Yeah.
Okay.
Praise be.
Certainly very different from the last whiskey. Very
There's a
different.
Strong whiskey odour emanating from the glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gunpowder.
Yeah, gunpowder, treason, and
nostrils.
definitely plum.
Yeah, give me your opinions before I start reading out the blurb.
I mean, there's definitely... peat, and heaven more peat would be my quick review of it.
Yeah.
I honestly can't taste anything apart from peatiness either. It's definitely mellowed a lot. I tried it without the ice to begin with, and that was not pleasurable. But now with the ice, a little bit diluted... Actually, it's quite drinkable.
Bad,
it's quite drinkable. It's just
it's quite a hard one if you were to drink it straight.
Yeah,
this is definitely one for your whiskey lovers, not for.
I do think it's got a little bit of a kind of sweetness to it. I guess the whole Smokehead thing is the peatiness.
I think that's what it's really going for.
Apart from peatiness, have you got any other flavours that come to your head before I read out the blurb?
A kind of tobacco taste.
Yeah, peat.
Okay, let me go through the description here, which is quite a lengthy one. It gives a description first of all for the nose, then for the body, then for the finish, and then for the impression, which I've never seen before. Is this a normal thing?
So what? Nose, body, finish, and impression.
Yeah. So nose, obviously, smell. Body, the first taste you taste.
What is impression?
Is it like The Hangover?
Oh, I thought it was just so humorous, and it just seems so nice.
He's great at parties, this guy. Yeah.
Okay, for the nose.
The nose.
Heavy smoke, tobacco, and peat.
That is all they put.
No, and then it goes on to amazing richness. Lemon.
That's just marketing.
Yeah.
Lemon, fresh ginger, plum jam, salty and spicy.
I mean, you could have put any
That last sentence wasn't
disposable
important.
fruit in that, and I would not be able to tell you that.
I can kind of get the ginger.
Really? My nose is
Kind
better
of,
than mine.
but
Have you eaten ginger within the last 2 days? Because it might just
To be fair, ginger and peat are
remember.
very similar ingredients.
I can't remember what I ate in the last 2 hours, Matthew. Yeah, it's true. I think I may just be projecting onto the whiskey. I think I can smell ginger. Maybe.
Okay, let's go on to the body. Like a cannonball. Hits the palate.
Miley Cyrus, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there isn't a picture of Miley Cyrus here.
So that was a wrecking bar. God, my pop knowledge these days.
Not like what it used to be.
So not down with the kids.
Yeah.
I thought they
Elliot
were all
used to-
doing podcasts. Isn't that why we're doing it?
I want to be cool. Okay, hits the palate at once with coca, peat, and some honey sweetness. Then explodes with some peppery spice and more earthy peat. Spreads to all areas of your mouth with more peat and light sweetness.
How many times do they use the word peat?
Well, we're up to 4 now.
Really? 4 in... Well, there must be about 30 words there?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
I would agree with that though. Just peat, little bit of
Bit more
sweetness,
peat,
more peat.
yeah.
Yeah.
And now for the finish. Even more peat. Spice and mandarin. Then dries up. When you think it's all over, the peat comes back to hit you again. Impression. A roller coaster of peat
Wow.
and
So
spice with some delicate sweetness.
Six
So
uses of peat.
it's peat and delicate sweetness are the two main phrases they
I
seem to
kind
be
of get
using.
there is a delicate thing there, but it's
There
just
is spice,
overwhelmed
but-
by...
Again, is that just peatiness that
Yeah.
it kind of envelops the spice? Is it all one and the same? I don't know. I have a lot of respect for them though. They haven't dressed it up too much. I mean, it would have been a lot funnier if literally just for every single one they just put peat.
Peat.
And that was
Yeah.
it. Just peat.
Just
peat,
one
peat.
word answer.
No, peat
And then some
times
more
2.
peat.
Impression PT. Let's just start with general impressions. Anyone want to kick us off?
I enjoyed it. It was a book that gripped me from the very beginning. I wanted to read page after page, a bit unlike the book we read previously where it was a bit more of an effort, especially the first part of the book, which we'll talk about later, really gripping, and some really interesting ideas that came up.
Yeah, I'd agree. I really enjoyed it. I thought it's got a lot of different layers to it. I'm always a big fan of that near future dystopian feel.
Yeah,
That
not
kind
too
of-
far in the future,
Yeah,
but near
that
future.
uncomfortable familiarity with the world. I think the kind of image and world that he creates in the book is I don't want to say appealing, but you get drawn into it just because it's so fascinating because of the language, the attitudes, and it's quite easy to almost trajectorize the world going that way. So yeah, I thought it was great, and I thought he could have very easily kept the book going on the same path as it was from the beginning, but it changes very drastically in different motions and in different chapters as it progresses, and that keeps it very interesting, I thought.
Yeah, as
And
we'll
now
touch
Elliot
on...
to slag it off.
He's always the devil advocate, by the way.
As we'll touch on later, when we go through just a bit more about what the book was about, I think the book for me, because it's really divided into 3 parts. The first part, I think it's so original, so it creates your own imagination about different types of language, about different types of characters, and it's really vivid and visceral. The second and third, I feel a bit more forced, and they're trying to use ideology, which can be a bit unless you're really nuanced, it can be a bit more difficult to put into a 150-page book. But overall, really enjoyed the book.
I would disagree there that it moves.
Before we go
away.
into, should we
Yeah.
summarise this bad
Yes,
boy?
yeah.
I'll
Let's do
start
that.
with part 1. Part 1 is these 2 nights of crime, which finish it. So 2 nights of crime which involved burglary, beating up, rape, and pretty much everything. And it ends with Alex, who's the main character, going to jail. So, do you want to explain part 2?
So part 2 is Alex in jail. It fast forwards 2 years once he served a bit of his sentence. Obviously quite dissatisfied, actually has quite a condescending attitude towards his fellow criminals, which is quite interesting. But it essentially follows briefly his life in jail, and then this opportunity which is presented to him to pursue an innovative new treatment which is meant to permanently impede. Completely oblivious to, is obviously concealed to him, he's very keen on, and it leads into a very different part of the book.
The third is him being let back out into the real world after undergoing this treatment of part 2. And in his encounters, he comes across a number of the people that maybe he did wrong to, or at least familiar acquaintances, which we'll touch on later. And ultimately, it ends with almost a positive note, because he seems to have impulses towards aging rather than, or at least, things more that you'd put to middle age, family, children, societal values that you don't really see in any part of the book.
For me, the last part of the book is, if you like the series of unfortunate events, you'll love the last part of the book.
Mm.
Just one thing after another of bad luck for him.
But but the ending of the book is almost a positive.
It's a reversal.
And I think the ending of the book, the last part, actually draws together a lot of the main thematic questions which are being asked in the book, in terms of, and we'll touch upon this later, in terms of morals, freedom of choice, violence in society. These questions are being asked throughout the book, and then at the end they coalesce. And I think so. It's, in my opinion, the most important part of the book.
Luke, can you please tell me what you've just told me before about that last chapter not being in the American version of the book?
Yeah, so this is something probably quite important to mention, that when the book was first released, it wasn't actually that popular. Even Burgess himself said that the film was what popularised it, particularly amongst the youth. The youth, Jesus, what am I? But there are actually two different versions. So initially it was released in the UK, and the book you now read is, or that you can pretty much only buy, is that version. But when it was first released into the US, and what actually, that's what garnered it a lot more attention, and what garnered the attention of Stanley Kubrick, who made it into a film. It was the same book minus the last chapter. And I think that's a very important chapter actually to exclude, because if you've ever seen the film, obviously it ends with Alex regressing, his treatment ceasing to work, and him
reverting back,
being able to suddenly indulge in all the violent thoughts he was able to before. But the ending of the original book has that part, but then goes on to portray Alex as trying to pursue his old life of violence and criminality, but out to,
because he's getting old and he's getting a bit tired.
Yeah, so I think it's a very important chapter. I think it's probably the most important chapter, and you realise that when you realise that there were those two different versions.
So, what do you think kind of Burgess's depiction of youth is? Because for me, it's not only a cultural, but it's also a biological concept, as the novel moves on.
I don't know if I agree with that biological concept, because not that much time actually elapses between, say, him being sent to prison, being released, and he's in prison for 2 years. He's 15 when the book starts,
and 18 when it finishes.
So it's not as if I think he was trying to say anything about suddenly the sudden maturity of 18 at all. I don't think it's biological. I think his questions are much more...
the book, for example, is called A Clockwork Orange, and he seems to draw a number of, at least in the end, he uses, I can't remember the exact phrase or exact sentence, but it goes round and round and round. And for me, that, at least I thought he was trying to very much draw upon the idea that youth and humans, they go on this kind of aged cycle of...
Just to add a bit extra to what Elliot's saying, at the very end of the book, he thinks, I'm growing up, maybe I don't want violence anymore, maybe I want to get married. But then he mentions when he has children, when they become teenagers, he'll have no control over them. And he makes no premise, unlike his dad, he will take control over his children. He says, no, I have no control over them. They will do the same cycle as me. Which I
don't think that's... he intrinsically links it to youth, because he portrays, say, that they're much older policemen as being just as inherently violent and horrible, and as he would, there's that kind of similarity between the two in the book. So I'm not sure he's saying anything necessarily about youth. I think it's more the broader
I think
theme of just violence in society and
what's
violence in people.
difficult about this book to kind of give generalizations against, say, other cultures, because it's very much done by one narrator. So you're really only seeing what his shoes, what steps his own shoes have done. So to try and kind of draw a narrative of what did older people, or what did what was the ethnicity, or how did religion play in this? It's very lopsided in that it's just Alex's worldview of the world, which is quite unusual. The fact that you've got a book that literally only uses one narrator, and in his words, your humble narrator.
Something that worried me about the book, Alex and his droogs being his gang mates, were doing was, it's just so ultra-violent, and he gives the impression everyone's doing it. But when he does get arrested, what you see is they specially know him. He's one of the well-known gangs of London at the time. So it gives you the impression that he is one of the worst, even in that society at the time.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. Yeah, he does seem to have some notoriety. But then is that just... It's a difficult one. Should we move... should we go through the questions, maybe?
And question 1 is, was Alex's film therapy helpful to him and society? Question mark, open bracket. If it hadn't been reversed, close bracket.
First of all, before we start talking about this question, I just briefly need to explain what the film therapy was. So, as Luke mentioned before, when he was in jail, they gave him the choice for this new therapy, of which he's going to be the first person to do it. And as part of this therapy, he gets given a drug, which makes him feel ill. And while he's feeling ill, he's put in front of these hyper-violent films, and what he does, his mind starts to associate violence and sex with sort of therapy. They stop giving him the drugs, but the association's still there. So if he watches the films and he sees violence, he still feels incredibly ill. Now this illness, it kicks in minutely after he sees the images, and even if someone gets into a fight with him, he can think about beating up the guy, but as soon as that thought's in his head, he starts to feel ill. Okay, so what do you think about the therapy, guys?
Well, this I think is actually a very fascinating question, because I think it brings out so many different questions on how do you deal with punishment as a society. And you have so many, I can't remember off the top of my head the kind of classical punishments, but you have punitive punishment, which is an eye for an eye.
Yeah, retribution.
Then you have I can't remember this. My RE knowledge is somehow a decade behind me. But it's trying to make your perpetrator eventually come back into the society.
Rehabilitation.
Reformation. Yeah. And I can't remember the third one, which I think is kind of a balance of both of them. Is making them pay for the crime, but also alluding to the idea. But when you look at those kind of theories and you start to move them onto maybe more philosophical level, you've got very much like a utilitarian, which is the idea that whatever is, if you've got 100 people, you pursue the ultimate goal that favours the 100 people rather than the individual. And then you obviously have the individual idea, which you should never have. You should always have the free will. You should have always have the ability to. Society should never crush you in such a way that you are not able to have your own free mind. And I think in the way Alex is dealt with is very much it's symbolic of these kind of different philosophical approaches kind of coming together.
Yeah, and throughout history we've seen those different approaches. For example, the medieval period, someone steals something, you put them in the middle of a village and chain them up so people can throw vegetables at him. Completely humiliating, very cheap punishment. But it's not going to make the person a better person. It's probably going to make them very spiteful. But, punishment has changed throughout history. But this is a new type of punishment we really haven't been introduced to.
But it's interesting that, so Elliot there mentioned utilitarianism, and that was obviously created by Jeremy Bentham, and he put a lot of effort and thought into the idea of punishment. He came up with the panopticon, the idea of, just the thought of being watched will enhance discipline. And he actually tried to design a machine that would...
No, prison.
That was the prison. That was
Yeah.
the panopticon. But he also tried to design a machine that would mathematically calculate the exact amount of physical punishment that should be given for a crime.
It sounds
Jeremy
like a
Bentham was
horrific
very
machine.
University College London. If
I've actually seen it. I mean, it's not as impressive, but I mean, after
No.
150 years rotting,
What's an impressive head to you?
I don't know, gold or some silver teeth, something to really kind of show
just
them.
maybe some cool face tattoos,
Yeah.
a bit of a Mike Tyson around the eye, just to let you know he had a wild side.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that there is throughout time been this burning question of how do you deal with punishment. And I did a bit of reading outside of the book, and I kind of found out that this part where Alex is going through this conditioning very much is linked to Burgess's own personal opinion of behaviourism, which was quite a popular movement when he was writing the book, which was obviously all about altering people's behaviour through conditioning, and he was very adverse to it because I suppose the question becomes, if you choose the right individual in the right circumstance, obviously it is beneficial, but who makes that decision and how far does it go? And we see it now, even in our modern society. We're all conditioned to do certain things, and conditioning has entered into multiple different worlds, into advertising. If you see a can with
Coca-Cola.
if you see a can with little water beads on it, you think of Coca-Cola, and that's a form of conditioning. And I think this is what Burgess was getting at, is that it's an incredibly dangerous thing, and that's why he presents that, whilst it may on the surface seem that Alex is being cured, it leads to such detriment to his life, not being able to defend himself, not being able to fight back, not being able to act as a normal person would
Or be a human.
in a normal situation. When there's multiple occasions where he gets beaten up, and you think, if that's applied to the wrong person and in a circumstance where they're unjustly being beaten up, then
so
you're
against the therapy he got?
I think, particularly as it's presented in the book as a government approach, I think it's a very dangerous path. As who then stops the government taking a political opponent and doing that to them, or anybody they want, and putting them into that form of conditioning.
Like seeing the Labour sign and then feeling ill every time you see it.
But it's the question of, it doesn't take much. If a government's willing to do that, extrapolate it out to what would they do to condition a population to vote for them.
Yeah, but
how
but
far
I mean,
could
the
they
same
take
could be said
it?
about terrorism laws. Putting someone in jail without a proper court.
Well,
Sure.
exactly, and that's the same
But
same
I
argument
mean, we
to be
can
made.
use a better example of Alan Turing, who literally was castrated because he was a homosexual. And, that's very much something that is completely accepted nowadays in modern day Britain. But we only go back 60 years, and that was, punished. So it can quickly twist from one vice that it views as abominable to now a vice that's actually openly accepted.
Yeah, in 50 years, I'm sure there'll be a lot of laws that, things that are considered, you can get a 7-year jail sentence for now, which will be okay in 50 years' time.
Yeah, so that's why I think, ultimately I would be against any idea that the state can control human...
See, for me, the acts of violence that he did, in 50 years and 100 years and 200 years, they will still be illegal. There's no way you can break into people's houses, beat them up and rape them. It's always going to be illegal.
That's true, but your question about did it benefit society, and obviously we're talking about the fictionalised society in this book.
Yeah.
Clearly it hasn't, and I think this is almost a point Burgess makes, where you view, particularly during the first half of the book, Alex as this sadistic villain, but then it's shown that, through the interactions he has, he's in a world of sadistic villains. Even the elderly people who obviously he had a run-in with, who he did injure, who he hurt at the beginning of the book, come back at him with physical retribution. It's clearly become this society where, if you can, physical violence is the best option. It is what is embedded in people.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes that question of this conditioning hasn't actually benefited society, because the way society is, they would almost need to do it to everybody.
So when he got put into prison, for a 14-year sentence, if I remember
I
correctly.
think it was 15, but yeah.
15 years. He commits manslaughter. He doesn't purposely kill the person. Well, pretty much is murder.
And I think he admits to all of his other crimes as well.
Yeah, he does.
So he admits to his rape.
Oh, I didn't. When I read the book, I didn't understand that he admitted to absolutely all of his crimes.
Yeah, because he was trying to incriminate his...
Other
obviously,
droogs.
Yeah, the droogs who betrayed him. So he admitted to everything.
Okay.
Maybe this is a good chance just to fill up the book with just a bit more character description. So we've discussed Alex, but the opening scene you've got his droogs, which is his kind of merry men or his gang, which is what, Dim, Pete and Georgie?
George.
Is it
yeah.
George?
Georgie, yeah.
And I mean, there's not too much to describe apart from Dim is, as the name would find him, is really just he's a brute. There's not much going on. But Alex is an interesting character because even though he's got this complete malevolent, violent side, he's also got a massive affinity to classical music. I mean, we started this podcast with one of his favourites, and Ludwig van, who he kind of mentions periodically throughout the whole piece of the novel. And it's very interesting that you've kind of got this extreme violence narrating with this kind of high culture. But the other characters that you see are the interior minister, who is a newly appointed government minister who really does propose
this new therapy.
The next character, probably of note, is it F. Alexander?
F. Alexander is probably one of the other primary characters, who's a writer that Alex and his droogs come across at the beginning of the book, where they break into his house, vandalise it, rape his wife, I believe,
and kill her.
I don't think they kill her.
No,
she dies later.
She dies
later from the trauma, although that's the association F. Alexander makes, and it's actually where the title of the book comes from, because F. Alexander is an author, and the book that Alex sees, a draft of the book at least, in the house is called A Clockwork Orange, and he actually bemuses over this a little bit in the book in terms of trying to interpret it, and it's explained by F. Alexander later when Alex, post his release from jail, comes across him by chance, and F. Alexander's trying to ostensibly use him as a political tool, but actually with the full realisation of what Alex is and who Alex is.
You know, when F. Alexander uses him as a tool, to begin with, I think he genuinely takes him out of kindness.
I don't believe
He's
so.
just been beaten by the police, and that's what he sees.
I think that's how it's portrayed in the film, but in the book, I don't think they make that, because in the film, obviously, there's that part where he singing in the rain, I think it is, when he's in F. Alexander's house, and that's what triggers F. Alexander's memory, where this, I don't think that happened in the book.
No.
And the inferior minister mentions later that F. Alexander has been writing a lot about Alex and talking about how Alex killed his wife. So I think there was, throughout that full realisation, you never see that distinct moment where he goes, "Oh, I know who you are." It seems to just all be a ploy to try and get him into this room and house and torture him, essentially. That's how I read it, at least. So this, I think
that goes to your question. So let me read it. Does Alex's young age redeem his behaviour?
And what you just said is yes.
No, what I was saying was just, I think it was something Burgess used to try and
I put the blame on society.
Open up the perspective of the reader to, maybe other faults in the society.
Okay,
or other faults
he's
in
a
the
sordid
person.
individual, but let's not blame him completely.
Whereas if they'd put him as an adult, it would have been much easier for the reader to think this is just a depraved adult. It's all on his doorstep. He probably would have become a less reliable narrator as well.
I think the thing that I don't agree with that perspective, because I think you'd have given a bit more backstory to Alex as a young man. So, say, as a 13-year-old, I did X, Y, and Z. But you really just have this young man who has great parents, people at school who are looking out for him. And then he just becomes excessively violent, excessively sexually explicit.
For me, you get the impression it's all happened within the last couple of years.
But I mean, there's no mention about his... It just seems that he's young. At least, I think... especially in this current era, where I think the youth are much better than their predecessors. I think it seems almost like he's trying to... This probably would have been a similar age where, you're starting to get mass media about young people and all the violence they do, and I almost think that there is definitely feeding into the tabloid press, or at least that type of hysteria about how young people are the kind of cause of violent crime, and I think he feeds into that.
It's obvious. In the 1940s, all those young people went to war. The
Yeah.
violence was brought out that way. In the 1950s, probably not talked about, but by the end of the 1950s, you'll have these questions brought up even more.
But I don't think Burgess was like that as a writer or an individual. I mean, he definitely wasn't above himself being sordid and controversial.
Yeah. This is what I'm not saying, but I think what I'm trying to say is I think he thinks that youth is very much a biological moment in your life where you act in a certain way that isn't necessarily your part. So what he's trying to say is, youth is, like a 5-year window, and after that you go through this cycle of hormones, of, so many different biological and societal
I'm going to be
impulses.
quite honest, with the final chapter where Alex says, oh, actually, maybe this violence isn't so good. I'm just going to grow up and have a family. I was a little bit pissed off by that. Like, he starts off the book as 15 years old and ultra-violent, and then by the time he's 18, he goes, oh, maybe it's time to start having a family. For me, I'd have found it more believable if the book had started maybe when he was 16 or 17 and had finished when he was 24.
The thing is, though, we never will know whether, if you could materialise the character of Alex, whether the next week after that he would have gone back to the violence. You never, you left with this question
actually,
of,
you're right.
Is this a permanent change, or, as he says in the book, is it just actually a weird anomaly of him not feeling up to it?
Sure,
we've all experienced people that one day say, oh, I'm going to sort myself out next week.
But when you end a book like that, it feels like it ended happily ever after. No one, if you read a standard morality tale, no one analyses ended happily ever after and thinks, oh, she probably did get raped after that. It always is kind of like, oh, it was fantastic. The prince
You
married,
put a finale there for a reason.
You were already in your head. So it's kind of a very... I think if you're ending a book with a happy ending, or at least this end point, you are trying to at least invoke of your audience that this is how things are going to progress.
So is that what... So I guess I have a question outside the questions we came up with before.
How dare you?
Not allowed.
Yeah,
£500
get back in your
fine.
box. Yeah.
You better have a licence for that, mate. What do we think what statement do we think Burgess was trying to make then with his ending?
For me,
Because you clearly think that it's that he wants to show that Alex is reconciled with humanity and permanently become a more moderate human, or
my statement of it would be that he sees youth as a biological disposition.
Yeah.
That all of these human tendencies of violence, sexual, explicit rape and stuff like that, which maybe can't be, with age you get a more more sophisticated view on it. But all these impulses where he's just he's just out of puberty. And all these coming off a man and everything like that. There's a lot of biology and brain.
I don't think you can, because there's so many characters in the book that are still just pervasively violent and vile into the their older years. You have the older or certainly
No. One of those policemen is maybe a year older than him.
Well, the not his friends. When he's taken into the station, they all beat him up, and the superintendent or the superior officer, who must be older, is there.
But
they
beat him to get a statement out of him.
But I think
I know
but
that shows a corrupt
shows
system.
That shows massively corrupt system, and then you have you've got in there as well there's just so many elements where you can't almost say, oh, he's grown out of it and ended up in purity, because there's so many characters who clearly haven't done that. The chap he finds living in his parents' house, when he comes back, when his parents come to visit him in the hospital, they say, oh, we actually got in quite a lot of trouble with the police, insinuating that he was actually quite sinister.
For me that was an insinuation the police have got so awful.
Maybe,
he was actually
yeah.
innocent guy.
It's interesting.
But I don't think he portrays adulthood in a particular favourable light either.
For me, the most important character about what Elliot was talking about before, and the fact when you grow older, you become effectively less sinful, is Pete. Pete is a member of the gang. He's the most neutral member of the original gang, and in the final scene, Alex comes across him, and he's a married man now. So maybe Pete was 1 or 2 years older than him, so by the end of the book he's a 19-year-old man. But for me, he represents, you've got the wrong group of friends, you're going to do what your friends do. You're not going to separate yourself. And I think that counts for a lot of teenagers. They're not...
Let's not generalise. Because, I mean...
It counts for a lot of teenagers, I'm sure.
I'm sure it does, but
I've
it
done
also
some
counts
bad
for
things.
a lot of old guys as well doing bad things.
No, because you choose your friends over the years.
But that's what I'm saying. It's
when
more
you're
about
young.
group identity rather than maybe let's label it to teenagers. Would be the point I was trying to make there.
No, but I think at youth you're so determined to be part of a friends group that you will instantly go for one. When you're older, you've got a lot of time to pick and choose.
I also think biologically you're a very different being than you are. I mean, this is again go back to minor. And so picking up on one of the characters who we do see progress through the novel, which is Dim, who becomes a police officer. I feel that, you know, his name gives the idea that he never had the ability to be part of society anyway. I don't think he ever really had the intelligence that Alex does to grow old. You know, he was always a buffoon. You know, like the idea that he was now going to become, you know, part of society was never possible for a character like Dim because
You'd be
That's
amazed.
quite a damning verdict to
Yeah.
society that someone like him becomes a policeman, isn't it?
But
So-
it's a dystopian novel. Of course, it's a damn.
Yeah,
it's a
true.
statement of.
Novel. One government which is a bit more blasé, a bit more freedom-loving, and then we see another government which is more hard-hitting, which takes away people's freedom. The same government that put Alex through this therapy, but the same government that employs thugs in the police force. And this book brings up the argument about what type of government do you want? Do you want a government which is less free-loving but much safe for the people living there, or more free-loving and less safe on the streets?
Again, this just goes back to the utilitarian v individuality argument.
Yeah, of course.
And I think ultimately Burgess is on the individual side of the perspective. I think he, you know, using Alex as kind of as prop, I think ultimately his narrative is saying, well, I think we value...
I'm going to go back to that first question I asked.
I'd agree, actually. I'd agree. I think he one of the way he exemplifies it is showing all these people, in a way, being just uphanded by a 15-year-old boy. And part of it is, yes, if you want to live in an individualistic society, you have to accept these dangers that come with it, but you should be ready for those dangers. And, you know, if I appreciate he's got a whole gang with him, but there's times when obviously Alex drives most of it himself. If a 15-year-old boy is going to overpower you and overcome you, that's almost a problem on yourself, I see it. So I agree with you there in terms of the collective versus the individual, but he's making a statement of, if you want the individual, you need to accept what comes with it. You can't have a perfect world.
You can't have an individual without violence and rape, because that is what an individual as a human
See, I
has.
still interpret this completely different from you guys. His therapy, which puts him off violence and puts him off sex. Those are the two things that put him off.
Yeah, and
Now-
Ludwig.
And Ludwig. Oh yes, this is
Inadvertently.
also very important to mention.
We
His-
will touch on, I think...
We'll talk
we'll
about it
touch this,
later.
yeah.
His therapy puts him off music, the music he likes, I should say. Is when in our everyday lives are we predispositioned to violence?
Predisposed.
Pardon? Predisposed to violence. So if, for example, if I'd gone through that therapy yesterday and I was having this conversation today, when would it have affected me?
No, but you're not... It's like saying, if I was in the Second World War, or the First World War, when would have this treatment affected me? Well, we're in completely different worlds.
Yeah.
So you can't just
but
parallel narrative of being in our current society to what his society
And
is like.
you probably don't realise how many maybe violent or aggressive thoughts you have a day
Yeah.
because you don't have this conditioned reaction. I mean, you can't
Well,
lie
that's a
and
very
sit
good
there
point.
and think, you know, as someone who, you know, you haven't just imagined, oh, I wish I could just punch him in the face. For Alex, that would instantly make him sick, probably violently sick.
There's an
That's
interesting
that's
scene
a
in
very
there.
good point.
There's an interesting scene where they're testing out his reaction to the treatment, and they get a guy come on, and he's poking him in the face and trying to get Alex to be aggressive, and Alex is doing anything he can do to avoid it.
Even offering to tie shoes.
And the audience is looking on and laughing because like in their heads they would have said something, and then a woman comes along in scantily dressed, and Alex starts to get away from her, and all of the sexual imagery is being removed, and one of the striking words or phrases he uses the sinful eyes. It's probably not exact, but of the onlookers, and he's very much saying, look, these people who are now viewing me, they have these disgusting thoughts already cropping up in their head, and I'm the one being punished for it.
Elliot,
Yeah,
this
that's
goes back
very
to
true.
It goes back to religious saying, "He without sin throws the first stone."
Yeah.
Do you actually believe in that?
No, we're human.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly,
devised-
which is his point. I
Yeah.
think this is really interwoven. I think exactly what you just said, Matthew, and definitely what Elliot just said. This is interwoven massively, and it's a big part of it as well. I think is his question of, well, what actually creates civility? We have Alex who listens to, Beethoven, classical music, a highly civilized, intelligent
It's a
individual.
juxtaposition.
He has good parents. He has state intervention after that. Very intrusive state intervention, and none of it actually works really. It's a case of what you do to imbue somebody with civility. In the end, it very much seems to just be a case of Alex's personal choice. It's hapstance. He just suddenly decides because of his personal experience, and I think it's a very big question Burgess is posing of how do you create a civilized, what actually makes a civilized society civilized, because he points out so many things we think make us civilized and then just undermines them completely.
Yeah. When you look at it through, I think the lens of Alan Turing, probably one of my all-time British heroes, and you think that the British government, in their divine wisdom, castrated the man with biological treatment, chemical, and you think how can similar to violence in Alex's case, it's a biological prerequisite that people are born this way, and yet there isn't. You can either do what the society in this is there, like we ban all of them, or you've got to try and find methods to use that individuality or that precondition.
See, for me, as I said before, if it's a crime where in 100 years it might be legalised, for example, possession of drugs, 500 years it might be legal, you can't put someone through this therapy, but if it's a crime that will be illegal in 100 years, I don't see why it's so awful.
But I mean, in this particular dystopian society, we're seeing violence, right? And the society is saying, we find this abhorrent. But in the next chapter, we see that this violence is now being authorised and perpetuated by the police on its own civilians. So this is where the narrative doesn't run. They're not trying to protect their society from violence. They're just trying to protect their own government.
I think Matthew's creating a bit of a personal paradox here, because it's raised in the book very directly that the main question over Alex's treatment is personal choice and the loss of personal choice.
Yeah,
this is
they bring
the
up with their religious.
The chaplain is trying to discredit the whole thing because of that loss of personal choice, and you don't seem to think it's that much of an issue. But when you're dealing with personal choice, it's got to be all encompassing. And even recently, being very topical about COVID, I know Matthew didn't like a lot of the measures that were put in by our local government here because of the issue of personal choice and freedom. And so I don't think you can say, it's okay for him not to have personal choice in this circumstance because of maybe the crimes he's committed or will commit.
Yeah.
But personal choice can exist otherwise, because then you're almost saying there has got to be this very clear demarcation. And when you're saying that, it's always a big issue, because then it's a question of where is that demarcation? Who decides on where that line
Exactly.
is?
And you've got this parody of violence to the state, which is
And
Alex,
violence from the state.
and the violence from the state, which is Dim, and his policeman.
That made me very angry, actually. That's the one point that I got angry in the book when I found that Dim had become a police officer.
And so, there is no, for me, there is no, I don't think Burgess is saying violence is a particularly, I don't think there is any real narrative in the book that says violence is a particularly unusual or a particularly bad thing. I think the only thing Burgess says, how do you protect a society against violence?
Yeah.
And it comes from both ways, and, we need to be equally vigilant. But, in order to devise rules, you've got to devise rules that encompass everybody rather than just encompass the state. What's everyone's thoughts on this week's whiskey?
I'm enjoying it more and more.
Yeah, it's growing on me. But then again, I'm having it with ice the whole time.
Yeah, I think...
I always have my whiskey with ice. So
I normally have it neat.
Really?
Yeah, 99% of the time. But I think this actually benefits from being a little bit watered down, just because it is so, to quote Matthew earlier, pungent.
Harry Potter and his spells.
Virulent on the nose and the mouth.
Yes, I like it, but it's not. I think if I was going to choose, I'd choose something a bit more sweet.
Yeah.
Like last last podcast, I think that whiskey was really kind of like easygoing.
Yeah, maybe we should start actually ranking the whiskies as we go along.
Yeah,
Just
that's a good
create
shout.
an ongoing leaderboard.
Well, first of all, we need to rank last week's whiskey out of 5 or out of 10.
No, out of
Well,
10 is easiest.
I think just a leaderboard. Just keep it simple. Just what we consider first,
Yep.
second, third.
I think I like that.
So my view would be the Pendrain last week is definitely better than this one. This
Yeah,
one
yeah.
has its own little qualities.
I mean,
mainly
with the
being-
Smokehead, you know what you're kind of going for, and it was. I think it was good to have that contrast of. I mean, as a new whiskey drinker, really. This is my question though: why does Ludwig van play such a important role throughout this book?
I just purely think it...
Sorry, just I
Yeah,
read it
yeah.
and I had no idea. It's one of those, I keep reading thinking I've got this theory, and then I read some more and it changes, and then I read some more. I could never put a pin thinking, yes, this is a succinct theory that's why I'm fascinated to find out what you guys think.
Well,
I don't think it has anything specifically to do with Beethoven. I think
No.
it could have been. I think it could have been
Any
Mozart
classical
or
music,
Wagner
yeah.
or
Sure.
whatever it may be. I just think that Burgess in his own way was trying to delineate how, despite what we may consider high culture, Alex was still an adversely or conversely violent and horrible person. I think he just used it as a way to develop Alex's character. Because lots of characters throughout the book mention how Alex is, smart. They say, "Oh, you seem like an intellectual young man, a cultured young man. How has this happened?" And so I think it's his way of... He doesn't want Alex to appear one-dimensional, I think.
for me, it's quite simple. The author. The author wrote classical music. He liked classical music. He had been beaten up as a youth, and he probably imagined in his head after he'd been beaten up, he probably listened to classical music to comfort himself.
This is a lot of speculation,
So,
Matthew, I
what's-
feel.
It's Wikipedia.
I want to give my
His
theory.
Wikipedia page.
Okay, so this is got some validity behind it.
Yeah.
Okay.
He on the Wikipedia page, at least, he'd been beaten up as a youth, and he liked to listen to classical music as a youth, which for me goes hand in hand with him listening to classical music and somehow planning his revenge, and then putting that into the character,
See,
Alex.
That's
My-
actually really interesting.
My
Alex
theory-
is a dark alter ego of
Yes.
Burgess in his youth.
Absolutely.
My theory, and it's actually before this, I didn't have a succinct narrative, and I think the more I've discussed this, the more succinct it's become. But I think when you look at the classical musicians, and you look at actually what were they writing about, most of their pieces were about battles, and it's this transposition of you have classical music interposed with the most core battles of people charging into guns or charging into swords or whatever, and it's this very much mixture of what makes high culture. Is it the people who listen to it, or is it actually the blood and the enlightenment that come together in order to finite a civilization? I think that is, for me, the kind of overriding narrative of the classical music being intertwined with the narrative.
See, this is... I don't feel either of you are kind of understanding it in any misapprehension. I definitely can side with you, because I think the idea of civility and what is civility comes into it a lot in high culture particularly. But I also think there is quite a lot of traction in what Matt was just talking about, because this is something I hadn't heard before, that obviously, yeah, Burgess was a fan of classical music. He wrote a lot of operas and a lot of music pieces.
You know, he
We've
wrote
heard
this
before.
book as an operatic piece.
Did
So
he?
all the
No
chapters, all the chapters are exactly the same length as an opera would be.
Well, exactly.
And he was brought up in Moss Side in Manchester.
Oh, wow.
So how the hell
Since
did...
he was
Yeah.
born then. Must have gotten a lot more sophisticated. But I think, it's raising a really interesting point that, this could just be a reflection of
Revenge.
revenge personally for him, of this almost character maybe he wanted to embody in his youth, that he wanted to
Be the masculine.
he wanted to, he knew he enjoyed classical music, he knew he was an intellectual, he knew he was a linguist. I mean, lots of the times in the book people get confused about what Alex is saying, and we know this is a language created by Burgess because he was a linguist as well, and he combined many different
Interesting.
elements.
Oh, we
And
need
so I
to
think-
we need to mention this about the whole Russian side of his language.
Mm.
So the language he creates, it's based, a hell of a lot of it's based off Russian, which he
Yeah.
recently started relearning when he wrote this book.
Russian Cockney rhyming slang and just made up mumbo jumbo, basically.
But interesting, when you think of, the alter ego of you as a young person, it's, I want to be the hardest motherfucker in the school.
Yeah.
And guess who's the hardest motherfucker in the school?
Dim.
No, it's Alex.
It is Alex.
He
Because
is-
Alex destroys
Alex,
Dim and
Alex
Georgie.
has Dim in his little group of, he is like alpha male of his year group. And, in all of our young aspirations, you wanted to be able to stand up to the kid who said, fuck you, and say, actually, fuck you, I'll fucking slash you. And, that is what he is. He is that alter ego of a young man thinking, fuck you, I am king. And, as a young person, that is, unfortunately, at least speaking
Yeah.
from a male perspective, that is very much an alter ego that you can kind of understand
And
and
he
fathom.
actually exudes a lot of that maturity which you want to, as well as a youth. That's quite cool, because when you're a youth, when you're young, you're normally quite impetuous and brash. But Alex, it's shown throughout the whole thing, he ruminates, he sits on things, he knows how to deal with, even though he's only 15, when he's questioned as leader, he's not automatically reactionary. He kind of sits on it and is quite stoic and
you-
hides his emotions and then strikes at the right
You
time.
contrast him with Dim, who's much harder than he is,
Yeah.
but has none of the personality and intelligence. So, Alex is really, if you think about it, he is that kind of embodiment of what you want to be young. You want to be smart enough that you can communicate.
But no,
and put
and again, I think...
for me, what Dim represents is he's just naturally violent, but if he's put in the right course, for example, if he's given army discipline, he will become an
I think
okay member of
Dim's just
society.
the most impressionable of them all.
Yeah,
But I
but
kind of want to
Alex,
continue on.
the
on
thing
your
about
point.
Alex is he is able to make a conscious choice about what is wrong as what is right. He even has a pass that's right. He only chooses what is wrong because it's more enjoyable. He
Well,
understands it.
I kind of want to continue on your point that this is a reflection of Burgess, because we've talked about then. Obviously, it feeds into the more broad image of yourself you want to be when you're a teenager. Obviously, for Burgess, he was bullied and liked classical music, so that's more of a link. And also, I mean, Burgess definitely had a sordid mind. I mean, so he had a very famous book called Earthly Powers, and the first line of that book is about this 81-year-old gay writer who's lying in bed with a teenage boy, and the Archbishop comes round, and he captures us all in a sentence. And he wrote this in the 60s, so he definitely didn't have, the cleanest and purest of minds. He had, quite a...
It wasn't
probably, especially for his time, quite a sinister mind. I mean, that even now, that first opening line, I can't remember it word for word, but is remembered as one of the most controversial openings to a book ever. So, which is very much like Alex. He has, it's just, I think there's a lot of Burgess in Alex in terms of Burgess clearly had dark thoughts, could clearly put his mind in very sinister places.
I mean,
wanted to maybe extract violence, loved the classical music.
He also wrote this in 4 weeks or something like that. So if
Yeah.
you don't embody a character and write a novel in 4 weeks, then you've got to have you're not human.
Well,
the only way you can get into that character and write is
to pour yourself into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so for me, when you look at the speed, there's got to be an inclination that you know this character in and out.
So do we?
That was inappropriate
If
use.
we follow in out.
Yeah.
If we follow that kind of that train of thought, does that then actually make the book a bit more superficial? Is it just Burgess, getting onto paper this kind of character he wanted to be when he was a teenager? Are we bringing all these questions about morality and about free choice?
I honestly, I don't
do you think he was actually putting that in the book, or do you think this was just some channeling of an inner teenage demon?
Well, let's look at the parts again. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Part 1 is where he splurges it all out, his inner feelings, and Part 2 and Part 3 are where the important questions come up.
That's true. Actually, that is very true. So
I always
maybe it can be broken up into that. Part 1 is the personal Burgess.
Which creates
allows
the questions come up later.
And then the second part is the big question of...
Should we bring up another question now?
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
we've kind of been flowing with... But let's go.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm going to go with experiences of Alex post-release from prison as retribution for his former behaviour or evidence that violence is a necessary component of the world.
So, I mean, I think we've touched on this.
We have touched on it.
We have, but I think, which is a real question, this kind of... And I think this is something that we haven't really touched upon, is how violence throughout the novel, and I know we've kind of briefly given semantics about, different... But how do you think violence changes throughout the novel? I think it's and also the punishment towards violence. And this is what I'm trying to view this question is
the meaning of violence.
Exactly, from both the state and both the individual. What do you think that whole narrative, when you put it together, is trying to say? So I don't know. Again, you look at the police violence or F. Alexander's violence. Like, what is violence?
For me,
the narrative given.
For me, in the first part with the violence of Alex, it gets more and more shocking as it continues up until them going to the house called the home and the stealing from the house and the beating up and the rape of the wife. And then from that the violence subsides. And only actually then, again, the violence becomes poignant to me when Dim, who is now a police officer, beats up Alex again. That's the only time where the violence ups the personal meaning to myself.
No, because they kill a prisoner as well. They kill a prisoner after the prisoner tries to
rape Alex.
Well, he jacks off next to him, doesn't he? I think is the thing he does. And they kill him. I think what Elliot is saying is quite interesting there, because in part 1, like you say, the violence is just pure savagery. It's just pure animalistic savagery, which is the way the world, particularly probably back then, just liked to view violence as a catch-all. But actually then you get different kinds of violence. You get Alex in prison maybe with a slightly justified violence against someone doing something quite perverse to him.
And that's why I didn't look at it as that badly.
Scientific violence in what they do to Alex, I would say. A kind of a meticulous violence they do against Alex. And then you, after that, get these acts of, retribution violence. And there are these... Yeah, he tries to create this much broader image of all the things violence can be, and I think this links back to the fact I think he views violence as key to society and key to humanity in a way.
One thing, when I'm looking at it now I think about it, is every single character in the book is violent,
apart from his parents.
So him, the interior minister...
80% of the characters are violent in some way or another.
90%.
Eventually, at some point, yeah.
Dim is then violent again, so the police, the state... interesting, religion is actually the one thing that isn't violent in the book. You know, you look at the Reverend or whatever, he isn't particularly violent, but you know the state is violent. Alex is violent. Like even F. Alexander, who you look as this kind of intellectual liberal, he's as violent as the next man, and you know he's supposed to be your audience. I think when he is writing this, he is picturing F. Alexander, you know, this kind of literate guy, reading his books in his comfortable middle class house, probably writing another shitty novel, and you know even him, put into that circumstance, wants to retribute and give violence. There is no character apart from, which is interesting, religious characters, which I haven't really thought about, but there's no real character in the book that you. I mean, the parents are given what, maybe like 10 sentences.
No, quite a bit more than that.
Really?
Not much more, to be honest.
20.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even their lodger, who they look as the, you know, ideal replacement to Alex, he's violent in the end.
To be honest, in the book, when I was reading the book, I kind of wanted to beat up the lodger. He was just so soft and sappy and like manipulative as well. I almost hated him more than Alex, because
What do you
at
think
least
he
Alex
represented?
is up front. I'm not sure he represented anything. I think he was just useful for a way to, you know,
He was a tool.
keep on enhancing Alex's misery. You know, he needed, you know, Burgess obviously just wanted all this misery to pile up on Alex, and he needed a way for his parents' house not to be a retreat. But I almost despised that lodger more than I despised Alex, because at least Alex was up front, and it goes back to that question earlier where, you know, if you're faced with Alex in the street, you know, yes, he may fight you and try and commit acts of violence against you, but in that situation you can commit acts of violence against him as well. The lodger, though, was just more about manipulation, and that I found was just, is not more despicable, but it just makes for such a more putrid character almost, because then they even lose their transparency. You know, they're horrible, but they don't even have the transparency about it. They're trying to portray themselves as nice, but they're
As virtuous, and yet...
An anti-hero, you might even say.
No, he's
No,
not.
he's definitely not an anti-hero.
No, God, how did you not get this?
Oh, that's what I meant.
Oh, no, I meant anti-villain.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
But okay, I suppose going back to you know, the original question, I think a lot of this basically concerns what your feelings towards Alex are. For me, I thought it was I didn't feel it was fair retribution. I thought it was just more that Alex was you know, a violent individual in a violent world, and simply a product of his environment, and a lot of the people around him were actually just as bad as he was. But from what you guys were saying earlier, or at least Matthew, you probably felt a bit more enjoyment out of Alex getting some kind of retribution against him, or getting some kind of further punishment, you know, I suppose. And this again ties into, do you view Alex as hero, villain? Because if you view him as the villain, you should really enjoy those old people beating him up in the library, and his life going terribly, and him wanting to kill himself, because that's how you're meant to feel towards a villain.
For me, I didn't mind the old people beating up because I knew they wouldn't kill him. But when the police, the representation of authority, they then start beating him up, that's when I really felt for him. I didn't really care.
Why then, though?
Because when authority beats you up after trying to retribute you, and they know that he's being reformed, that's what I felt strongly about.
But everyone else knows he's been reformed. It's been in the papers. No, the old people know he's been reformed. Everybody in the book he comes across after prison knows he's been reformed.
No, because he's trying to explain it to the elderly people.
Yeah, but they know.
But it's been in the paper that morning, the time he's got out.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah,
so
they
hadn't seen it.
They haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
But the prison officers know about it. His parents don't even know about it.
Okay,
Yeah,
I think we should wrap it up with one more question.
Can we go for my final question?
Yeah, let's go for your final question. That's a very good question. If you were to create a fictional slang language, what language would you base it off?
Elliot, you first.
but I think if I was going to base it off, I'd base it off English. And what I'd use is there's so many colloquialisms. I mean, for a country that is only, 200 miles wide by maybe 50 miles across, we have so many different dialects. I'm including Scotland and I'm also including Wales and Ireland if they allow me. If you could just have a language of I think you would have a hell of a language. So I even though yes, it's it is my language, but I think for just the nuances of each different province and to each different place is for me. I mean, yes, very naive, but I think I would just use an English, not Cockney slang, but an English slang throughout the whole provinces.
If I was going on to a language I'd have to use, it wouldn't be Spanish, because, me and my amigos would never sound as good as me and my droogs. I'd have to go for Chinese. I think it's unusual enough it would have worked.
It would fit in as well with probably the way the world viewed Russia in the 60s is very similar to how we view China now.
Yeah.
In terms of that concerning power.
Of the future.
Yeah. I think it should be commented that how genius the Nadsat language is.
Oh, it's very
Yeah.
How meticulous it is.
Also how engaging it is, and also how the fact that you read the book and it took me a while to get out of not that I would say I was thinking every line in Nadsat, but I would often just be like, when my imagination would flow, I'd be there like, oh yes, my rooker and my gullivers.
Yeah.
There's
And
so
some
many
things seem to, you're right, create like a flow about them. Like saying, oh, I viddied now, after reading the book, to me, makes so much sense to mean you seed. It kind of...
I mean, even just, touching on Luke, who gave the, fantastic introduction to this, what it took you about 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to write the introduction, and for somebody to write an introduction, okay, yeah, it's not perfect in Nadsat, but it's pretty good. And for you to write it, so quickly, and all of us to be, it was very good, and it just shows there is some creative genius to that, and I've got to put my hands up, and I think that is, for me, the greatest part of the book.
Yeah. Do we think the complexion of the book would have changed a lot without the Nadsat
Of course.
speech?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course.
I
It would
think
not
made
be the icon that it is without that.
It
No.
was necessary.
Which I think would have been very brave for him, because can you imagine creating that kind of language story? People could read it long enough to start to even understand. I mean, because in my book, I didn't
he
even...
was weighing it up, I'm sure, the whole time about how much he could include and
Yeah.
how much he couldn't include.
Because my book doesn't even come with any references or anything about what any of the
so
words
funny
mean.
enough, the book
There's
that-
no bookmarks. You just have to learn as you go along, and somehow you do.
I like
He
that, though.
contextualizes it really well. You do start to figure out quite quickly.
So the book that I bought off Amazon, it was designed for higher level German readers, so it had German translations at the bottom. And to begin with, I used those German translations until I realised Nadsat was based off Russian. So as soon as I realised that, I just kept using a Russian dictionary when I came across a word I didn't
You can
understand.
call your wife that. Okay, well, before we end, I think we should all give, we've read 2 books so far, so do we all think that this was better than Dante's Inferno?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, so on our poll ranking, we've got at first Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, second Dante's Inferno.
By Dante. And on the whiskey, Pendrin first. I think we decided
I think
after,
so, yeah.
after tonight, and Smokehead, is that what it's called again?
That's the one.
Smokehead second, but
We're going
I
to
think
need to
if
get like
we-
a nice tally board, aren't we?
yeah, it's going to start to get complicated. We definitely can't hold this in our heads.
Well, Top Gun's
Well,
Does
fun.
everyone
Past
give
two
a,
episodes.
I suppose, a finishing thought on Clockwork Orange? A finishing summary?
Okay, finishing summary from me. Good book. I think I might read it again another 20 years. It was a good book. I can't say more than that.
Yeah, I actually think it's a must-read for most people. I think if you focus on all the different thematic points he's trying or potentially trying to draw in, it can become a little overwhelming and dense. But as a story and as an imagined world and a book that raises a lot of poignant questions even today, I think it's excellent.
I probably have to second that. You know, I love the imagination of creating your own language, and then not only creating your a language, but then using that language to, not reinvent, but dictate some of the most graphic and violent images that really literature had never ever seen. It's wow. You've got to be that's the only thing I think that is the slight downfall of the book is it tries to pack too much ideology into a book, and that's not a criticism, because the ideology makes it fascinating, but because you're trying to do this in a language that isn't as supple and as diverse as the English language, which has taken thousands of years to produce, it will become difficult. But ultimately, I think it's a fascinating read, and I would thoroughly recommend it. But there is some critiques that need to be shouted out. Anyway, thank everyone, thank all of our amazing listeners. I'm sure there's going to be hundreds this time, because
and
also sorry,
and if anyone dislikes us,
100.
before we end this podcast, whoever you are, you motherfucking scumbag who disliked our podcast.
Can we use more polite language, please?
No.
Okay, yellow-bellied
You
coward.
yellow-bellied weasel. Matthew here he's up for fighting you. Okay, so you just you name your time, you name your hour. He's going to be there.
Yeah,
Okay.
don't hide between the anonymity of the internet. Come onto the podcast as a guest.
Yeah, actually,
Critique us.
honestly,
Yeah, we'll audio you in. We'll link it up. It's the modern age. Wherever
after
you are
your
in
fight,
the world.
whoever survives, you can be on the podcast.
Well, you're saying so if I die, I'm off the side
Yes,
of the podcast.
that-
To be honest, even if Matthew survives, we may still take you on.